Good morning and welcome to Coffee with Bann. Today's brew is Maxwell House Vanilla Caramel Latte Instant Cafe Style Beverage, because today's topic is emulation. Oh crap, that's L. Oh. Oh, that is so weak. I don't think I added enough of the powder. Yeah, it needs more. Definitely better. Okay. Still not fantastic, but like better. I think the taste is just overall weak. It doesn't really taste like coffee. Anyway, so emulation is something of a hot topic. But then again, it kind of has been for many years. If you don't know what emulation is, it's basically tricking a game into thinking it's running on the hardware that it was intended for, right? So like a Game Boy emulator would trick a Game Boy game into thinking it's running on a Game Boy when in fact it's running on a computer or something. Fairly simple concept. The emulators themselves are not simple in terms of making them. Running them varies. But I would say that emulation is easier than it's ever been before. Or at the very least better than it's ever been. No, it's easier. It's easier than it's ever been. Man, this stuff is not fantastic. Now, there are emulators for nearly every console. And some that people might call emulators, but aren't technically emulators, like Shad PS4, which is technically a compatibility layer and not an emulator, but it's close enough that we can kind of group it in. But there are so many consoles where you can just download the program, drag the game into it, and just run it, right? Which has not historically always been the case. A lot of the time, back in the day, you would have to do a lot more work to get an emulator to run. And in some cases, there just weren't emulators. And moreover, you'd have to do a lot of your own work to change settings for each game individually, because not all games perform the same on emulators. Some are simpler, some are way more complex. And it could be a complicated method of playing games. But nowadays, a lot of emulators are decent enough, or even good enough, that you don't have to worry about per-game settings. Or if you do, that's mostly for controls. Now, there are still some, especially with newer systems like Switch, where you do have to change specific settings per game in order for things to run right, or at least performantly. But for most consoles, you can, as long as you've got the games legally backed up, of course, you can absolutely just drag and drop it into the emulator, and it'll run. You might still have to set up controls. Depends on the emulator. Now, Nintendo emulation is what I'm most familiar with, and I would argue it is what... Nintendo emulation is the most mature, like, in terms of all of the different console manufacturers. Emulators for Nintendo consoles are the most well-made, most consistently good. And there has been an emulator for every Nintendo console except the Switch 2, but the Switch 2 is also less than a year old. Give it some time, somebody will do it. Hopefully. But, like, some emulators have been in development for so long. Like, SNES 9X, which I think was 98 or 99 when it came out, still exists. It's still in development. It's a good emulator. It's not the most accurate, of course, but it's performant on fairly lower-end devices, and it works. It just works well. Of course, there is one major glaring exception to the idea of Nintendo emulation is generally fantastic. 3 letters for you. N64. 2 of those are numbers, but shut up. I'm sorry, that was mean. But the N64 is still a complete mess. Let's consider, with, say, the Wii, you can download Dolphin, make sure you've got your games ready, just open the ISO for your game with Dolphin, and it's running, and it will work. Dolphin, in particular, is actually really insane. Dolphin is probably the most mature Nintendo emulator, I think. Especially considering the fact that it is not the oldest. I want to say it started as an emulator specifically for the GameCube in 2004 or so. I would have to check, though. Thankfully, I've got my lovely laptop here. Oh, I'm sorry. 2003. Dolphin has existed since 2003. It is not the newest emulator, but it's not the oldest. But I would argue it's one of the greatest. It's incredibly simple to use. It is incredibly simple to set up. And it's very powerful and configurable. Also, it runs well on even some really old or crappy devices. Consider the device that I am currently using to record the audio for this video. It is a Surface Pro 3? It's a Surface Pro 3, released in 2016. It has 4 gigs of RAM and I think a Core i3, maybe a Core i5, like 4th generation in it. By no means would I expect it to be able to emulate a Wii. It does not seem like it would ever be powerful enough for that, but Dolphin is just so well optimized. And if it doesn't work, there's the fork Ishiruka, which is built off of an older version and still uses a lot of per-game hacks, but you don't really have to configure that much, and it'll run even better on lower-end devices. And Dolphin is also one of the emulators that I think has the most control support, like controller support. You've got your regular gamepads, but you can also connect a GameCube controller through the through the official Nintendo Wii U / Switch GameCube adapter, or you can connect an actual Wii remote using Bluetooth. It just works. Of course, you'll still need a sensor bar, but thankfully, that doesn't actually need to even plug into a computer. If you have an actual Wii, you can just hook it up to that, turn on the Wii, and use it for Dolphin. Or you can use 2 T candles. The Wii Remote really doesn't require that much. But yeah, it's wild just how much you can do. Now, Dolphin is... I don't know how to put it. I don't know. Dolphin is probably my favorite Nintendo emulator overall, which... Is it weird to have a favorite Nintendo emulator? Is that strange? Probably, but I still love it, no matter what. But there's an emulator for everything, low-end or high-end for every console. So, like, NES, you've got Mason or Meson, I don't know, for high-end with, any of the others for lower-end. You can do Quick NES, FCEUX, I don't know, there are others. I can't think of any off the top of my head. I primarily use Mason. SNES, you've got BSNES, or BSNES for higher end, or SNES 9X for lower end, or SNES 9X for lower end. N64, you've got Bloated Mess, or Ares. And Ares is definitely for high-end devices. But the Mupen 64 is fine, and Project 64 is fine, I guess. But if you can, Ares is the best in terms of accuracy, and not in terms of user simplicity. GameCube and Wii, you've pretty much just got Dolphin, which sounds bad, but it is also such a good emulator that you don't really need others. There's just not a whole lot of reason to look elsewhere. Dolphin is just one of the cleaner, better emulators. Wii U, I think there are a couple, but the only real option is Cemu, or Cemu. I don't know. Cafe emulator. And then Switch is kind of a weird situation. So for a long time, since about 2018, there were 2 major Switch emulators. There was Ryujinx, and there was Yuzu. And both have died. But not through drama, not through the developers just wanting to stop. It was specifically due to Nintendo's intervention, whatever. Nintendo actively stopped their development. And then they came back, sort of. Yuzu had a few forks that died out pretty quickly, and then the one that remained is called Eden, and Ryujinx just kind of got a couple of forks also basically called Ryujinx. I think one is actually Kenji NX. Either way, Ryujinx is sort of kind of back, while Eden is just a continuation of Yuzu, basically, but without all of the Patreon stuff. Then as far as handhelds go, You've got MGBA for Game Boy, Game Boy Color, Game Boy Advance. You have a couple of options for... Well, okay, actually, if you're running a lower-end device, then for GBA you might want to go with, you might want to go with GPSP. It's not as accurate, but it's perfectly adequate. For DS, you've got a couple of options, Melon DS and the worst choice. Okay, seriously though. Melon DS is the best of the DS emulators overall. It's not perfectly accurate, but I would say that it is more accurate than the competition. There's DSMU-Me. Try remembering how to capitalize it off the top of your head. Bet you can't. Capital D, lowercase e, capital S, lowercase m, lowercase u, capital M, capital E. It's dumb. It's weird. Now, DSMU-Me is kind of weird in that it's a DS emulator, and for a long time it was the default DS emulator. It was the default DS emulator because nobody else was really making a better one. You always had No Cache GBA, which also did DS, but like, no. I don't consider that a real option. Unless you are running a device that cannot run Melon DS or DSMU-Me. No Cache GBA just isn't an option, really. But DSMU-Me has been plagued with a couple of issues, namely the developers absolutely despising Pokemon, and if any issue shows up in Pokemon, they refuse to fix it. That's just a thing, apparently. I don't know why. They just hate Pokemon fans. Which, I mean, I can understand disliking Pokemon fans, but disliking the entire series to the point where you're not willing to make it more playable on the emulator that's supposed to be reasonably accurate, that's ridiculous. Anyway, 3DS has a 3DS has two options now, actually. So there's Azahar, a fork of Citra, which died when Yuzu did as collateral damage. And there is, I think it's called 3D Beans? Oh, sorry, just 3 Beans. Which is interesting, because it's just straight up a low-level emulator for 3DS. It's not meant for enhancements, it's meant to be accurate entirely to the 3DS. It's not all the way there, but like, it's pretty cool. Azahar, because it's built off of Citra, is kind of a little bit of a mess. It's not ideal, like, at all. But it works. It's got a weird thing where if the game stutters, it'll, like, speed up afterward to try to get back to where it should be. And while I can understand that for multiplayer, single player suffers really badly because, it doesn't feel good. It just doesn't. That's actually something that Dolphin specifically added recently because of multiplayer, and thankfully with Dolphin you can disable it. Citra is not the most accurate emulator. But it is, it's there. It's still probably the most fully fledged 3DS emulator. And then there's Mikage, which, let me check, has not released. Mikage has been in development since 2019. Closed source until somewhat recently. You haven't been able to download it or use it. And back in January of last year, they made an open source repository for it, and it hasn't been updated. We haven't gotten anything about Mikage since then. Even the Patreon has been silent. I have not been able to test Mikage because the open source version so far just hasn't been buildable. At least not on Windows. It doesn't have a GUI, I can't get it to build. It's just... it's weird, because, like, it looks like it's gonna be fantastic, but there's nothing. Anyway, 3 Beans is looking cool. Azahar is just as whatever as it has ever been. And Mikage is nothing. Now, Nintendo obviously is not the only console manufacturer. There's also this little one called Sony. Don't know if you've heard of them. They make the PlayStation. And Sony's consoles have always been just a little bit more difficult to emulate than Nintendo's. Probably partially because the fan base for PlayStation is less enthusiastic than Nintendo. But PS1, pretty great overall. At least from what I've seen. I don't really play PS1 games much, but there's a good emulator that works well called DuckStation, but that one kind of cheeses me off because they swapped from an open source license to you can look at the source and not use it at all. Which, rude. There's a fork called Swan Station that builds off of the last open source version, and that's what I would probably recommend. I think there are, there are definitely other PS1 emulators, but the only one that I have had any experience with is DuckStation / Swan Station, and I haven't had a whole lot of experience with either. PS2 has PS2 has PCSX2, which pretty good overall. It's also got Play! PCSX2 is definitely the more mature one of the two. They're both perfectly fine. Unfortunately, PS1 and PS2 require you to dump BIOS images in order to run the games, which is annoying because legally that means you have to have an actual physical console, not just the games. And that sucks. There might be an open source BIOS for either one, I'm honestly not sure. And then PS3 emulation, which, if you don't know, the PS3 is kind of complex. No, like, really complex. Like, what is this? It is meant for developers to make games in a very different way from standard processors at the time, or even now. Now, I cannot at all claim to understand how the PS3 is. I am not a developer, I don't know about any of it, but I do know that it is incredibly difficult to develop for and very complex internally, and so, emulating it is also hard, to the point that Sony has never attempted it. But the fans have. And RPCS3 is difficult to run. Most PS3 games are not going to run well on it, at least unless you've got a really good computer. and you have to have the full BIOS image and the console's firmware. And actually, do you need the BIOS or just the firmware? I do not know now that I think about it. BIOS might be part of the firmware. Either way, it is a pain to set up, it's a pain to use, but it does work, in theory. It's just so incredibly complex that it's most of the time not worth it, and you would be better off just getting a PS3. And PS4 emulation isn't exactly a thing. Like, there are a couple of compatibility layers for PS4 that allow you to play PS4 games on PC. It's not technically emulation exactly, or at the very least a lot of people will tell you it's not, but it's sort of the same idea. And it is not there. It's really not there yet. I think there's a PS5 compatibility layer as well, but that's even more difficult to use and even less mature. And, like, it's just, I don't know. Main reason people use Shad PS4 is for Bloodborne, which hasn't been released anywhere but PS4. Which, Sony fixed that. But... Other than that, there's not really that much reason to use it. There aren't that many PlayStation 4 exclusives, and certainly not enough PS5 exclusives to really warrant getting a, to warrant making a PS5 compatibility layer. Although that might be changing soon. Sony has said that they're not going to be putting any more PC ports onto Steam or anything anymore. So, I don't know. We could see that change. Now then, the third console manufacturer, Microsoft, with their Xboxes. So, the original Xbox has an emulator. It has a couple. But for some reason, it's not super easy to emulate. Probably partially because most people don't really care about the Xbox that much. It's got some weird issues, from what I remember. The Xbox 360... The Xbox 360 has the weirdest setup for emulators I've ever seen. Like, there is pretty much one 360 emulator, if I recall correctly. Huh. Okay, so yeah, there's pretty much only one. It's called Xenia, and it works sometimes, doesn't work most of the time for me, and it is not very accurate, but some games are playable. Also, it doesn't support XNA, and that sucks. I would love for it to support XNA. I want to play Speedrunners HD, darn it! But I can't. And then, Xbox One and Series consoles. So, Xbox One and Xbox Series consoles run basically PC architecture. They are pretty much just computers with some custom hardware in them in order to keep them from running computer software. Right? So, any emulators for them are pretty much just going to be compatibility layers similar to the PS4 and PS5. But the thing is, we haven't really cracked Xbox. There was a small amount of time where there was a mod available for Xbox One and Series. and it got patched pretty quickly. And even then, it wasn't like a full hack. But we managed to get enough information with that to be able to create a working compatibility layer. I don't remember what it's called. Okay, so actually there are two. There's XY1, which hasn't released. Kind of a similar situation to Mikage in that regard. And there is Windarango. Windarango runs 3 games. One of them being Minecraft. And you know what? If it's only going to run a few games, I'm glad one of them's Minecraft. I love Minecraft. But it's not, it's not really usable, for the most part. It just kind of exists. Technically kind of works, but like, it's just, I don't know. It's not far enough to really have a whole lot of opinion on it. There is now a mod of the Xbox One. Only certain revisions, like physical consoles, but there is one. And we have had no progress since, pretty much. And the Xbox Series, forget about it. No. This is probably because of dev mode, which I mentioned in my Xbox episode, but, yeah, there's not a whole lot in the way of Xbox emulation. Emulation. Which is unfortunate, but, like, admittedly, how many diehard Xbox fans are there that actually really care about anything other than Call of Duty? The answer isn't 0, but it's not that many. Beyond that, there is other stuff to talk about. Namely, there's a little program called RetroArch. Or RetroArch. I call it RetroArch, because I like that. It is a program meant for every old emulator, right? Like, it's... Okay, so there's something called libretro. It's a library that you can build emulators using. And RetroArch is just a front end for that. But basically, it's a multi-emulator program. And it has an emulator for a whole lot of stuff. All the Nintendos up through the Wii and 3DS. PlayStations 1 and 2. I don't know that it has an Xbox emulator. I don't think it does. But it's also got some weird stuff like Palm OS or Symbian. There's a J2ME interpreter in there. And it also has stuff that's not emulators, like just straight up a couple of different ports of Cave Story. Or 2048 if you really want that. Right? Now, RetroArch can definitely be convenient, but at the same time, it is a little bit of a mess for the layperson. There are so many menus and so many different settings to configure that just trying to get through everything and get a game running properly the way that you want it is difficult. There are other libretro front ends like Ludo or I don't know, something else? One sec. Whatever, the two primary ones are RetroArch and Ludo, with a couple others mixed in there, and like on Android there is Lemuroid, but for the most part, you're kind of stuck with RetroArch. Now, there there are some emulators that you can't actually really run without RetroArch, or some kind of libretro front end. Namely Genesis plus GX, which I desperately wish had a standalone version. Well, I mean, I guess it kinda does. There's the Wii version, which was what it was initially built for, but like, that got ported to RetroArch, and it didn't get ported to other platforms regularly. It's kind of the best all-around core for Genesis emulation, and is a pretty good one for other Sega consoles, but it's exclusive to libretro, which I do not like. I want standalone emulators. I like standalone emulators better. Now, companies, particularly Nintendo, will try to tell you that unofficial emulation is illegal on the face of it, and you're not allowed to do it. No. But that's just straight up not true. Courts have ruled that no, emulation is absolutely legal, you are allowed to do it, it's just piracy that's not. And Nintendo has decided to threaten legal action against people anyway, specifically because they know that people can't afford to fight it in court, and would likely go bankrupt trying to. So, yeah, Nintendo are kind of bullies. Of course, this probably wouldn't be that much of a problem if Nintendo were actually, you know, providing any kind of decent emulation officially. But for the most part, they're kind of not. Now, Nintendo does have official emulators for a lot of their consoles. They've got NES, SNES, N64, and GameCube so far. As well as Game Boy Color, Game Boy Advance, and they have done DS. But most of them, at present, are not that good. Well, okay, NES and SNES are actually pretty solid. N64 is, still a little bit of a mess, and in fact, has kind of regressed since their first go at Virtual Console, back on the Wii. And GameCube is adequate for the most part, but it's got a little bit of input latency that I just cannot handle. I can't play games that way. And for their handhelds, they've mostly got it figured out. Actually, for their handhelds, mostly they've been made by Nintendo European Research and Development, or NERD. And those guys are freaking fantastic at their jobs. But then, for some reason, for the home consoles, they keep using IQ. Which, why? Why do that? Pretty sure it was IQ that did the GameCube one, but honestly, we haven't been able to dig into it because we haven't really hacked the Switch 2 properly yet. But yeah, official emulation doesn't tend to have really any enhancements or anything. Nintendo's barely has, rewind and save states. They kind of treat it like non-priority, and, it sucks. Whereas, with a lot of PC emulation, you can run your games with mods, and higher resolutions, replaced textures, better frame rates, all of that. And it's fairly easy these days. And it's just kind of unfortunate that companies don't want to be competitive anymore. Although Nintendo has actually, done something good with the Switch 2, that being, they are providing better ways to play some of their games than even emulators can give, right? Like Mario Odyssey playing Mario Odyssey on Switch 2 is just straight up a better experience than running it on an emulator for the most part. Because, like, yeah, you can enhance the resolution the same way, but the Switch 2 version has less level of detail issues, fewer level of detail issues, and better frame rates for like, far away animations and such. So Nintendo actually did good, which is nice. But for the most part, they don't really try that hard. And it's unfortunate. Now we get to the part that I love. Emulation is not exclusive to PC. You don't need one of these in order to play your Game Boy Advance games. You don't even need one of these, a dedicated little handheld emulation thing. You can use something like this. This is a new 3DS XL, which is in worse condition than when you last saw it, most likely. Some of the paint has started to chip off, and I'm very sad about that because it looked nice before, and now it does not. Deeply unfortunate. Anyway, any console that you can mod, you can emulate on. And what you can emulate varies wildly depending on the hardware. Like, on a 3DS, you can emulate GBA, but it's better to just use a compatibility layer, like GBA Runner or what's the other one called? OpenAGB firm. That's it. On a PS3, you can run NES, SNES, Genesis, GBA, and that's kind of like the extent in terms of how high you can go. Just because we haven't made a decent N64 emulator for PS3. Although, on new 3DS models, you can run PS1 games. Which, they're not going to run fantastically, but, like, you can run them. On a 3DS, you can run some N64 and PS1 games, and that's pretty cool, honestly. Now, it does take more work than just setting up an emulator on a computer, but that makes sense because you also have to do all of the, modding stuff. I just love that you can do it. And it is something that I dabble in quite a lot. In fact, if I were to open up my 3DS, turn it on, you would probably see at least 10 emulators. I do love me some random emulation, even if honestly I don't play games that much. I like setting up emulators. Well, no, sorry. Even if I don't actually play games on emulators that much, and usually not to completion, I like setting them up. I like messing around with them. They're just neat pieces of software. Or hardware, if you're using, like, an analog device or something like that. Which, by the way, FPGA-based devices that are meant for running old games, still emulation, just hardware emulation, not software. It's the same idea as software emulation, just using physical hardware to replicate the, to pretend to be the original hardware rather than using a program. It's neat, but, like, it's not inherently better. So the moral of the story is, N64 emulation requires plugins that you have to swap out for different games, and everything is a mess, and it's just not great, and Nintendo absolutely could do better than fans, and yet neither one does good. And this has been Coffee with Bann.